Welcome to another story of ancient nights. As always, I'm curious to know from where in the world you're listening, so let me know in the comments. Tonight's story comes from a very old land, from the hills of Judea, from golden pastures and olive groves, from a time when kings were chosen not by crowns, but by quiet voices. It's the story of a young shepherd boy named David, a boy who asked himself a simple question one evening beneath the stars. Can I really become the greatest king Israel has ever seen, starting from nothing? He didn't know the answer then. He didn't know that the answer was already being written. Settle in, close your eyes, and let's walk with him across the hills of his childhood, into the palace of a king, and all the way to a throne. Part 1. The Shepherd Boy. The hills of Bethlehem, long golden hills, rolling slowly toward the horizon, covered in soft dry grass, scattered with olive trees, quiet in the afternoon sun. This was where David spent his days. David, the youngest of 8 brothers, the smallest, the one his father Jesse sent out each morning with the sheep. He was young, maybe 12, maybe 13, thin arms, curly hair, the color of ripened wheat, eyes that were soft and watchful. He carried 3 things with him, always. A wooden staff, smoothed by years of handling, worn dark in the middle where his hand rested. A small leather sling, simple. 2 long cords, a patch of soft leather in the middle for a stone. The sling was coiled, most of the time, at his belt. And his harp, a small harp made of olive wood and strung with gut strings. It fit in the crook of his arm. He had built it himself. It had taken him months when he was younger. His father had helped. The harp was the thing he loved most. Every morning, before the sun was fully up, David left his father's house. He walked down the stone steps, into the courtyard, past the well where his sisters were drawing water, past the kitchen where the smell of baking bread drifted out into the cool air, past his older brothers, already dressed for the day's heavier work. He walked to the pen where the sheep slept. The sheep knew his voice. When he opened the wooden gate, they rose slowly, one by one, shaking off the dust of the night, looking toward him with their quiet eyes. "Come on," he said, softly. And they came, a slow river of white wool flowing out of the pen, spilling onto the hillside path. He counted them as they passed. 58, 59, 60, all here. He led them up the hill path. The air was cool, still. The sky was pale, the color of a robin's egg. A few stars were still visible in the west. A single hawk circled high above, black against the sky. David walked slowly, letting the sheep set the pace. They walked past a fig tree, past a flat stone that looked like a sleeping camel, past the old olive grove that his grandfather had planted. The path was one he knew by heart. The sun rose behind him, slowly, painting the backs of the sheep in pale gold. He led them to the wide pasture. It was his favorite place, a long stretch of soft grass on the eastern slope of the hill, bordered by low stone walls built generations ago. An old fig tree stood at the far end. A small spring bubbled up from the rocks nearby, filling a clear stone basin with cold water. The sheep fanned out. Their heads went down. They began to graze. And David sat. He found his usual spot. A smooth rock, warmed already by the morning sun, near the fig tree. He laid his staff across his knees, unslung his harp, and began to play. The music was simple. He wasn't trained. No one had taught him. He just played what he felt. In the morning, the songs were quiet, soft, rising and falling like breath. He didn't sing yet. In the morning, he only played. The sheep grazed slowly, and the music drifted over them like a blessing. The hours passed. The sun climbed. The shadows shortened. A breeze moved through the olive trees, stirring the silver undersides of the leaves. Far away, he could hear the distant bells of another shepherd's flock on another hill. Sometimes he would stand, walk among the sheep, check that none had wandered too far, run his hand along a woolly back. One of the lambs, the youngest, always followed him, a little white one with a black patch over her eye. She trailed him wherever he went. When he sat, she curled up beside him. When he walked, she trotted behind. He had named her Ayala. It meant doe. At midday he rested. He sat beneath the fig tree in its wide-spreading shade. The sheep, who had eaten their fill, also lay down. The whole pasture grew quiet, only the hum of bees in the nearby wildflowers, only the soft sounds of breathing. David opened his small food pouch. A piece of brown bread, thick and chewy, a few black olives, salty and soft, a small wedge of goat cheese wrapped in a cloth, a handful of raisins. He ate slowly. He tore off a piece of the bread, let it soften in his mouth. The olives tasted of salt and earth. The cheese was tangy, cool from the morning. He drank from a small clay flask he filled each day at the spring. When he was done, he wiped his hands on his tunic, leaned back against the tree trunk, and closed his eyes, just for a moment. The afternoon sun was warm, the shade was cool, the bees hummed, the sheep breathed softly in their rest. And a thought came to him, quiet, gentle, like a question whispered by the wind. Can I really become something more than this? I am the smallest, the youngest. I watch sheep. I play a harp. I live in a small house on a hillside. My brothers are strong. My brothers are tall. My brothers are the ones that matter. And yet, sometimes, when I play, when the music comes through me, I feel something. I feel large. I feel like something is calling. He didn't know what it meant. He was only a boy on a hillside with sheep and bread and a harp. So he let the thought drift away, like a leaf on the wind. And he opened his eyes again and looked out at the hills and the sheep and the blue, blue sky. And for now, that was enough. The afternoon passed slowly. He played his harp again, this time softer, more dreamlike. He watched a lizard sun itself on a warm stone. He watched a line of ants carry a piece of fig back to their hole. He watched the shadows grow longer, slowly. The sun began its slow descent toward the western hills. The light turned gold, then amber, then soft rose, and he knew it was time to go home. Come, he said to the sheep, softly. They rose, slowly, one by one. They knew his voice. They knew the time. He led them back down the path, through the olive grove, past the sleeping camel stone, past the fig tree, down into the valley of Bethlehem. The little lamb Ayala walked at his heels, and above him the first star of evening began to glow. Part 2. The Quiet Anointing. One evening, something unusual happened. David was coming home with the sheep, as always. The sun was low. His father Jesse was standing in the courtyard, waiting. But he wasn't alone. There was a man beside him, an old man, dressed in a long gray robe, with white hair and a long white beard. He carried a wooden staff of his own, and something else, a small clay flask sealed with wax. The man's eyes were kind, but they were also searching. David, his father said, gently. This is Samuel. The prophet. David bowed his head. He had heard the name before. Samuel, the old man who spoke with God, who had anointed King Saul many years ago, who was said to wander the hills of Israel, listening for voices that other men could not hear. Samuel stepped forward. Slowly, he looked at David for a long time. Not harshly, not with any test, just looking, as if he were seeing something beyond the boy, something in the distance. And then, very quietly, he said, "Yes, it is this one." David did not understand. He looked at his father. His father's eyes were wet, but calm. Samuel unsealed the small clay flask. Inside was oil, olive oil, rich and golden, pressed from the hills around Bethlehem. He poured a little of the oil onto his hand, and then gently he placed his hand on David's head. The oil was cool and warm. At the same time, it flowed down through David's curly hair, slowly, down the side of his face, down into the cloth of his tunic. And Samuel said something very quiet, something like a prayer or a blessing or a promise. David did not hear the words clearly, but he felt them. He felt something settle over him, like a cloak, like a weight and a lifting at the same time. Something that said, "You are no longer the shepherd boy. Something's coming, someday, not yet, but someday. Prepare." Samuel took his hand away. He smiled, softly, with a touch of sadness, as if he knew things about David's future that he would not say. "Keep watching the sheep," he said. And that was all. The old man turned, walked slowly out of the courtyard, down the stone steps, back toward the road that led out of Bethlehem, and he was gone. David stood in the courtyard. His father came to him, embraced him, said nothing, just held him for a long moment, the way fathers do when they don't have words. Then his father walked back into the house, and David was left alone, in the fading evening light. He went to the pen, closed the gate behind the sheep, checked that the water trough was full. He walked up to the flat roof of his father's house, the way he did on warm nights, sometimes, when he wanted to sleep under the sky. He laid down on a rough-woven mat and looked up. The stars were coming out, one by one, thousands of them, the familiar stars of his childhood, and he ran his fingers through his hair and felt the oil still there, cool and strange, fragrant with olive. What does it mean? What am I supposed to do? I am still the youngest, still the smallest. I still watch sheep. Nothing has changed. And yet, everything has changed. He did not feel afraid. He felt quiet, as if something very large had been whispered into his ear, and he was still listening for the echo. He closed his eyes, and he slept, a deep sleep, full of quiet dreams. And the years passed. Seasons came and went, winter rains, spring wildflowers, summer heat, autumn harvests. David grew taller, his shoulders broadened, his hands grew stronger. He still watched the sheep, still played his harp, still walked the hills of Bethlehem. But sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit beneath the fig tree and remember the touch of oil on his head, and the old man's kind, searching eyes, and the question would return softly someday. What? He did not know, so he did what he had always done. He tended his sheep, he played his harp, he waited. Part 3, the harp in the palace. Then one day, a messenger came to Bethlehem. He arrived in the afternoon, a man on a horse, dressed in fine cloth, dusty from the road, carrying a rolled message sealed with the mark of the king. He asked to see Jesse, the father of sons. And when Jesse came out, the messenger said, "King Saul is unwell. Something disturbs his mind. His servants have advised him that music might bring him peace. They say your son David is a skilled harpist. The king has sent me to bring him to the palace." Jesse called for David. David came in from the fields, his hair damp with sweat from the day, his harp under his arm, as always. His father told him what had been said. David listened quietly, and then he nodded. "I will go," he said, simply. He prepared a small bundle, a second tunic, a spare cloak, bread and cheese for the journey, his slingshot out of habit, and his harp, his most precious thing. He said goodbye to his mother. She held his face in her hands, kissed his forehead, and did not cry, though her eyes were full. He said goodbye to his brothers. Some clapped him on the shoulder, some nodded with respect. The older ones were proud, the younger ones curious. He said goodbye to his father. Jesse held him close and whispered in his ear, "Remember who you are." David did not fully understand, but he nodded, and he rode away on a small donkey the king had provided, following the messenger down the long road. They traveled 2 days through the hills of Judea, past villages and vineyards, past shepherds just like him, watching other flocks on other hillsides, past olive groves and ancient wells. They stopped each evening beneath a tree, ate their simple meals, slept under the stars. David did not speak much. He watched the land. He listened to the wind. He thought about the palace ahead. He had never seen a palace before. On the 3rd day, they arrived at Gibeah, the city of the king. It was larger than any town David had ever seen. Stone walls, high and strong, a gate reinforced with iron, guards in polished helmets, streets lined with stalls, spices, fabrics, pottery, the smells of cooking fires and incense, the sounds of many voices. David rode through slowly, wide-eyed but quiet. The palace rose at the far end of the city, tall, built of massive pale stones, with cedar beams carved with patterns of pomegranates and lilies. The messenger led him through a side gate, through a courtyard filled with guards and servants, up a wide stone staircase, into a long hall, and at the end of that hall was the throne. And on the throne was King Saul. Saul was a tall man, taller than any David had ever seen. But he was also tired. His face was lined with worry. His eyes were hollow. His hands gripped the arms of his throne tightly, as if he needed to hold on. There were dark circles beneath his eyes, as though he had not slept well in many nights. He looked at David for a long moment. Then he spoke. His voice was low and weary. "Is this the boy?" "Yes, my king," said the servant. "He is very small, but skilled with the harp, my king. They say he plays as if God himself is listening." Saul grunted, waved a tired hand. "Then let him play. Let us see." David was led to a low stool near the throne. He sat, very simply, like he had always sat on his rock beneath the fig tree. He set his harp in the crook of his arm, let his fingers rest on the strings. He looked up briefly at the great hall, at the high cedar ceiling, at the great stone pillars, at the guards standing silent, and he breathed in and began to play. The music was simple at first, just the softest notes, like rain on olive leaves, like wind through wheat, like water flowing over smooth stones. The hall grew still. David did not look at anyone. He closed his eyes. He let his hands do what they had always done. Let the music come through him, from somewhere he did not name. He thought of the hills of Bethlehem. He thought of Ayala, the little lamb. He thought of the stars over his father's roof, and he played, and something began to happen. The tension in the room began to soften. The guards, standing stiff, relaxed their shoulders. The servants at the far end of the hall grew still, listening. The king's advisors, who'd been whispering, fell silent, and Saul slowly leaned back on his throne. His grip on the armrest loosened. His breathing deepened. The lines on his face softened just a little. The darkness that had been pressing on him lifted just a little. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in many weeks, he rested. David played for a long time, until the light through the high windows turned gold, and then amber, and then rose, until the servants lit the oil lamps on the walls, until the king was breathing slowly, steadily, like a man in deep, peaceful sleep. Then David set his harp down, very softly, so as not to wake the king. And that was the beginning. From that day, David stayed in the palace. He became one of Saul's musicians. Whenever the heavy darkness fell on the king, David was called, and he played, and the darkness lifted. He slept in a small room near the king's chambers, simple but clean, far simpler than he had imagined. He grew to know the corridors of the palace, the guards, the cooks, the old servants who had been in Saul's service for decades, and sometimes, on quiet afternoons, he would slip away from the palace, walk out into the nearby hills, sit on a rock, and play his harp for the wind and the grass, as he always had. The palace had not changed him, not yet. But the question, the old question, came back to him sometimes. Can I really become the greatest king Israel has ever seen, starting from nothing? He still did not know. But now, he had seen a throne. He had sat near one, close enough to touch. He had watched a king from very near, and something inside him recognized it. Not with hunger, not with ambition, just recognition. As if a door had opened somewhere deep inside him, and he had looked through it and seen something he could not yet name. Part 4. The Long Road to the Throne. The years passed again. David grew into a young man, strong, wise, beloved by the people of the palace and by the common people of Israel who heard of him. He had a way with words, a way with music, a way with people that was quiet and true. There were challenges along the way. There were battles. There were dangers. There were long seasons when King Saul's mind turned dark, and David had to leave the palace and hide in caves and wildernesses. But the story of all that is for another night. For tonight, we stay here, in the soft middle of David's life, in the years of learning, in the years of waiting. And we skip forward gently to a quiet morning many years later. It was a spring day in Hebron, a hill city in the south. The almond trees were in bloom. The wind carried the smell of blossoms and fresh bread. The sky was a soft, soft blue. David was no longer a boy. He was a man, with dark, curly hair, beginning to be flecked with silver at the temples, with weathered hands, with calm, wise eyes. He was dressed simply, a white tunic, a brown cloak, leather sandals. He did not look like a king, and yet. He stood in the open square of the city. All around him were gathered the elders of Israel, old men in their finest robes, grave, bearded, solemn. They had traveled from every tribe of the land. They had come to do one thing: anoint him king. David stood very still. He remembered somewhere deep inside him another anointing. Long ago, in his father's courtyard, the old prophet Samuel, the cool oil, the strange weight and lifting. He had been a boy then. Someday, the oil had said, and now someday had come. The oldest of the elders stepped forward, a white-bearded man trembling slightly with age. He held a great horn carved of ox bone filled with olive oil. He raised it, and with both hands, slowly, gently, he poured the oil over David's head. The oil flowed, slowly, richly, down through David's hair, down the sides of his face, down his beard, onto the shoulders of his white tunic, into the folds of his brown cloak. It was warm and heavy and alive. It smelled of olives and sunlight, of earth and sky, and as the oil flowed, David closed his eyes, and he remembered everything. He remembered the hills of Bethlehem, the golden grass, the sheep, the little lamb, Ayala, who had followed him everywhere. He remembered the fig tree, the spring of cold water, the taste of bread and olives at midday. He remembered his father Jesse, his mother, his brothers, the stone house on the hillside. He remembered his harp, the first one he had built, the feel of the strings beneath his fingers. He remembered the old prophet Samuel, kind eyes, a sealed clay flask. He remembered sitting by a tired king, playing music until the darkness lifted. He remembered caves and wildernesses and long nights under stars. He remembered the voice from long ago asking, "Can I really become the greatest king Israel has ever seen, starting from nothing?" And now, standing in the square of Hebron, with the oil flowing down his face, he finally understood something. He had not started from nothing. He had started from everything. From the hills, from the sheep, from the harp, from the music, from the waiting, from every quiet afternoon beneath the fig tree, from every step along the path, from every night beneath the stars. The greatest king was not made by conquest. The greatest king was made by tending, by listening, by waiting, by walking the hills day after day with a quiet heart. He opened his eyes. The elders were bowing. The people were shouting in joy. Horns were being blown. The almond blossoms were drifting in the spring wind. And David, the shepherd boy, the harpist, now the king, smiled softly, like a man who has finally come home. Part 5. The King Who Remembered. That night, after the ceremony, after the feasts and the songs, after the palace servants had lit the oil lamps and the great hall had emptied, David walked up, alone, to the roof of the palace in Hebron. He sat on the low wall at the edge of the roof. The city of Hebron spread below him, small stone houses, flickering lamps in windows, dogs barking in the distance, the quiet murmur of people settling into their evening, and above him, the stars, the same stars he had watched as a boy, from the roof of his father's house in Bethlehem, long, long ago. He had brought his harp up with him, the same small olive wood harp, the one he had built as a boy. The strings had been replaced many times. The wood had been polished by decades of use, but it was the same harp. He held it in the crook of his arm like an old friend, and he began to play. The music was simple, like it had always been, like rain on olive leaves, like wind through wheat, like water over smooth stones. He did not play for a king tonight. There was no tired Saul to soothe. There was no palace court to impress. He played for himself, and for the stars, and for the boy he had been long ago on another hillside. And quietly beneath his breath as he played, he began to sing. A song he had written a long time ago under the fig tree in the pasture. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. The words were simple, The melody was simple, but as he sang them, sitting on the palace roof, the newly anointed king of Israel, he understood them more deeply than he ever had before. He had spent his whole life being shepherded, even when he did not know it, through the hills of Bethlehem, through the long years of waiting, through the palace of Saul, through the caves and the wildernesses. He had been led, gently, always, beside still waters. And now, here he was, on a roof, under the stars, with his harp, a king. He played until his fingers grew tired. Then he set the harp down, beside him on the stone wall, and he leaned back, rested his head against the warm stones, looked up at the vast, vast sky. The stars were brilliant, countless, ancient. He thought softly of all the shepherds who were, at that very moment, out on the hills of Israel, watching their flocks, sitting by small fires, looking up at the same stars. He thought of the boys especially, the youngest brothers, the small ones, the ones who were overlooked. He smiled. Keep watching the sheep, he thought. You don't know yet what you are becoming. Just tend, just wait, just be faithful to the small things. The rest will come. And his eyes grew heavy. The wind was soft. The stars were patient. The city below had grown quiet. The little lamb Ayala, long gone now, still walked through his memory, following him up some eternal hillside. His mother's hands, his father's embrace, Samuel's searching eyes, the cool olive oil, the sound of his harp in the great hall, the weeping king, the open roads, the caves, the wildernesses, the anointing, all of it had led here. He closed his eyes and slept, a deep sleep, on the roof of the palace, beneath the stars, with his harp beside him, the sleep of a man who has come, at last, to his rest. And the wind blew gently over him, and the stars wheeled slowly above, and far away on hills he could no longer see, shepherd boys watched their flocks and played their simple harps and wondered softly what they might become. And there, we'll leave him. King David, the shepherd, the harpist, the one who tended and waited and was faithful to the small things, asleep on the roof, beneath the ancient stars. Thank you for spending this quiet time with us tonight. If this story brought you peace, consider leaving a like or subscribing. It helps the channel grow. And remember, wherever you are in the world, whatever hillside you're on, tend your sheep, play your harp, be faithful to the small things. The rest will come. Sleep well, and we'll see you when you're ready for another story.